partiamo.
Good morning, Prof.
Okay, so good morning. Let me start the appeal today with Professor Geraci from Nottingham University in China. And thanks to all participants. And let me transfer the microphone to Serena. And thanks, Serena, to introduce Professor Michele Geraci. So just 15 minutes and then more space for questions and some sentences and opinions to share with all. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor. I'm Serena Fiorani, and I am a first-year student of the Master of Science in Business Administration at the University of Tor Vergata. Today, I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to all of you Professor Geraci. Professor Geraci was nominated Under-Secretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Development in 2018. He was responsible for international trade and investment. And before taking this role, he was one of the four candidates for the Italian Prime Minister. And during his mandate, during the government, he was actively committed in developing a new strategy, a new commercial strategy for trade between China and Italy. And he formed the so-called Task Force China. And then in 2015, he received Italian kind of honor by President Mattarella for his great effort in fostering the relationship with China. He lived in China from 2008 to 2018, where he worked as a professor in some universities like University of Beijing, where he was awarded honorary professor. And then, for what concerns the educational background of Professor Geraci, he holds MBA, Master of Science in Business Administration, and an undergraduate degree in electronic engineering at the University of Palermo, Italy. And today, Professor Geraci will talk about the global crisis we are experiencing currently, and he will mainly focus on the role of Europe and China. And so thank you all for your attention. Have a great lecture, and I leave the floor to Professor Geraci. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. Thank you, Andrea, Professor Tavoletti, Professor Ronzoni. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello to everyone, all of you who are connected. I will give a very brief talk, 10-15 minutes, so that we can leave time for a Q&A afterwards. And what I would like to tell you is a mix of what I have gathered the experience and learned in my 10 years that I lived in China, combined with my most recent year in the Italian government, where we tried, as you have probably heard, to build a closer relationship between Italy and China on several layers, the basis of which was a commercial layer, because we did find out, well, we didn't find out, I knew, but when I came here, people were companies, even my colleagues in the government, trade associations, we all realized that we were falling behind. Basically, the relationship with China had not been built on a solid basis, notwithstanding the efforts of previous governments, visits by President Mattarella and many other prime ministers. We missed that little extra thing that would turn all these words into numbers, numbers of exports. And as you know, Italy is the European country that exports the least toward China. So we're trying to rebuild the relationship and increase exports as well as imports. I never really focused on trade deficit or trade surplus. I was more taking the view, let's both increase import and export, the sum of import and export, not the difference. That was my main focus. And then let's see what happens. And we realized that, of course, that this was very difficult. So I want to share with you only a few numbers, just one or two slides to show a little bit of what is the real factual data situation between Italy and China, and then in general between Italian compared with other European countries. And then I'll give you a little bit of my soft views about what China can do. The question for today is, out of this crisis, who will come out as a relative winner? China or Italy or Europe? And the answer to me is very clear, China. Italy and Europe will enter, I believe, a serious, not recession, but a tout court crisis, institutional, social, and economic, from which we will very, very hard come out. And I will take questions on these. I gathered this back in February when we were looking at the impact of this virus on the Italian economy, and me, analysts, former colleagues in the government, current people in the government, we had estimates that were varying by a ratio of 20 times. So some people thought the impact would be 1, some people thought the impact would be 20. Lack of real grasping the magnitude of the situation. But let's go to numbers so that we all see what is the terms of trade. I'm using an improper term. What is the Italian exposure to China purchases? And this is an exercise that I did recently by looking at what are the official numbers from Istat, the Italian Statistic Office, on Italian exports to China. This is in US dollars, so it's about 15.5 billion of goods Italian export to China. The question here is, what happens if Chinese demand shrinks, as it would, on Italian export? Is this the 15.5 the whole story? Is that the exposure of Italian exports to a potential shrinking of Chinese demands on import? The answer is not, because there are other components, and they come from these various effects. First of all, I add another 5.6 billion, which are Italian goods exported to China via Antwerp and Rotterdam, the so-called Rotterdam effect. This is because of the invoicing. It does not take into account the final destinations, and that's why if you look at the values of Dutch import and exports are way, way, way above what the size of the economy would suggest. So Italy sells 15 billion directly from Italy to China. When I say directly, I mean directly identified in Italy as being sent to China. They can go via other routes, of course. And then there is another 5.6 that are in Italian Statistical Office recorded as Italian exports to, let's say, Holland. But they do not get processed, just get put into a container and sent to China. So that's the total Italian goods, final goods sent to China. Then we have services that we always forget about. It's another couple of billion that in the current situation does add something. That's not all. Then we have another almost 10 billion, 9.8 billion, which are Italian intermediate goods sold to other countries. These other countries then reprocess them, and they will then sell them on to China. Now, while this 5.6 billion, there is something we can do in terms of tracing, invoicing, destination, and we can try to rebring them back into our statistics. This 9.8 billion is component parts that we sell, for example, automotive parts to Germany. That's a classical example, which then gets sold into Germany. So this, inside this 9.8 billion, there is the German cars produced in Germany that get sold to China, that take into components from the northeast of Italy. And this is a very important part, and this completely is missed in the statistic of Italian exposure. So while this is not part of the negotiation that we can do with China when we look at import-export deficit, because this number does not appear in the bilateral trade statistics, because indeed this is a trade that an Italian company does with a German company, with a French company, and so it's a bilateral relationship between Italy, France, and Germany. But if we are interested in what happens to the Italian economy if Chinese demand shrinks, then these numbers becomes relevant. So if we add them all up, we reach a total of 33 billion, pretty much double what we had originally started from. So this is the total Italian gross exposures to Chinese demand. There is an extra bit, about 3 billion, which is another layer, is Italian intermediate goods sold to China that then China repackages and sells them to third party. That we need to add to reach a total of 36 billion. Now, this 36 billion is Italian exposure to China, but that's not entirely the exposure to Italian GDP, because of this 36 billion, a part is components that we acquire from abroad, the so-called backwards value chain. And of this 36 billion that we sell directly or indirectly to China, 7.6 are acquired from foreign countries that export into Italy. So the net remaining value added is 28 billion. So this is 28 billion is the net impact, basically Italian GDP, that is exposed to swings in the Italian demand, in Chinese demand. And this is why already at the beginning of February, I was telling you the estimates of a potential negative impact on Italy of Chinese virus and therefore lack of demand. If we imagine the Chinese imports goes down by 20%, this hits entirely directly this 28 billion of Italian GDP, the range of 5.6 billion, 20% of 28. So 5.6 billion, let's say about a third of Italian GDP, would have 0.3 would have been a immediate direct impact just because Chinese demand for Italian goods or Italian indirect goods was shrinking. So of course, I remember at the time we were looking at the impact of the virus as a 0.2% on the total Italian economy, while 0.3 was already the impact of China without taking into account other indirect effects, global equilibrium models, and then as we saw the impact on the Italian economy. That's why now we're talking about 10, and I would say 10 is almost a positive estimate for Italian GDP loss. So this is the situation of Italian exports. A big problem because the exposure is much higher than people believe, and so we underestimate. The other big problem, and this is the second and last slide, is the composition of Italian exports divided by size of companies. And this is, to me, one of the biggest problems. You know very well, so I'm not telling you maybe anything new, is Italian exports is composed here, the 50%, these exports to the world and not necessarily to China. 50% of Italian exports are made up by large companies, 250 people and more, and the remaining bottom part is made up by small, medium enterprises. So Italy exports 550 billion, almost 1/3 of its GDP to the rest of the world. Of these exports, half is handled by large company and the other half is handled by small companies. And this is why Italy is in a big disadvantage to our main competitors, Germany, and to some extent also France, because their export instead is handled almost for 80% by large companies, and only the remaining 22% is handled by small companies. Now, in this situation of global chaos, it is clear to me that the small, medium enterprises, Italian, while they thrive in a growth environment and they represent the uniqueness of our enterprises, of our industrial structure, when problem happens in international world, globalization, fast and frequent changes, they are the ones that do not adapt very quickly. And of course, they don't have the scale to compete with price. But as other countries increase in scale, such as China, quality and quantity go hand to hand. So we are in a situation where China increases its scale. By increasing its scale, it lowers its average prices. It has the possibility to reinvest extra profit into R&D, and so then also the quality increases. So by going down the quantity curve, China also goes down along the learning curve. And the comparative advantage that our small, medium enterprises have is put at risk, because we never had scale, so we never had quantity, we had quality. But little by little that can be eroded. And within Europe, the Italian companies are more exposed than any other European countries to this potential erosion competition. That's why I am extremely worried. And this is something that, again, you that do this, you know very well, but the general public and people in the administration are not fully aware of. So these are the numbers. I'll give you now the couple of minutes view on what I think about China. And I want to make clear to our students here, China has an immense capacity to adapt, way, way beyond what we normally believe. This is a mix of the social economic system with a strong government, but also a strong population that adapts for many reasons. So historical reasons, they've been used to serious difficulties in the past. They even inherited, even young people have partially, not all, inherited the memories of these difficulties. But fundamentally, when there is, every time there is a global crisis, every time foreign demand decreases and China suffers, like we had in 2008, China does that. It closes back into itself and accelerate its own process of transformation, of trying to get less and less dependent on foreign, on external demands, and try to accelerate its transition, its transformation of its domestic economy. In 2008, when we had global financial crisis, exports, Chinese exports fell a little bit. China did the 800 billion stimulus package, and they use it also to develop its high-speed network of railway. And today, China has the biggest, fastest, and best high-speed railway in the world. As a result of that crisis, there are many situations. So when the US would not sell electronic components, China developed its own supercomputer, which is now the fastest. The same for artificial intelligence, infrastructure. And now the issue that we're looking at is the China famous 2025 manufacturing plan. So if there is a problem of demand on Chinese goods, I think this will only help China accelerate this process. And remember one thing that I always use as a final conclusion, if I may, a slogan. The key difference between the West and China, there are many differences, but the American dream is an individual dream. And so people do want to be like Sergey in Google, maybe Donald Trump. It's an individual dream. The Chinese dream is a collective dream. It's a China dream. It's not always a Chinese people. Why the American dream is a dream of an individual, and to some extent also in the Western culture, in China is a collective dream of the country. And this ties and brings up together the people, and with the powerful government that forces the path that the country needs to take, it does find a soft humus in the people that do accept it, because the goal is to make China improve along economic, social, political axis. And so this is the strength of the Chinese economy. And that's why I think out of this crisis, even in the face of 6.8 drop in GDP, the people here in the West worry, wow, this is the first time in 5,000 years. It doesn't really matter, because China will, if they want, reinvest whatever they need to compensate. In China, the GDP is a input, not a output. It's whatever the government wants to achieve, they will achieve, because they have a high component of GDP coming from investment. And so whatever gap is needed to compensate a potential lack of consumption, they fill it up with extra investment. I stop here because the time is already past 15 minutes, and I open to Q&A. Anything you want to ask? Thank you.